All right. Hey, when everybody listen up.
I don't like drinking out of straw. Guess
Okay.
where that straw went?
All right.
Guess
Okay.
what the hat that we're playing? Yeah, that's what I meant. And that plane is about that far away.
All right. On a piece of hardware, when you are tightening down a bolt, when you're tightening down a bolt, and you have a required torque, 40% of the twisting force is the force, the friction, which underneath the head of the bolt. And 40% of the rest of the, another 40% of the twisting torque is due to the friction in the threads. And that only leaves 20% of the friction due to the inclined plane of the threads. So I always wondered about that, you know, how much is really being applied, you know, because of the incline of the threads. And the threads are the least of your problem, but there's a lot of friction is under here and then in the threads. That's where 80% of your friction is. And only 20% is due to the slope of the threads. Okay, so with that in mind, if I had to screw a bolt together, what do they, when they give you a required torque, the torque is so when it pulls together that during use, the things never move. If you left a bolt on that was a little bit loose, every time the force is applied to it, the bolt will stretch a little bit. It'll move. And then it'll join back together. When the load is released, it'll stretch again, release, stretch and release. So just like on these crankcase through bolts on the engine, every time a cylinder fires, those bolts are trying to be stretched. Except what they have done, but with proper torquing, when it's cranked to the proper torque, they are pinched together. The bolt force pulling together is much higher than the cylinders can push out. So does it make sense that if it's put together tight enough, the bolt is never allowed to spring out and, you know, stretch out and go back. So there's no movement. And almost all torques are based on this principle where once it's put into service, it no longer moves again. But when you leave a bolt loose, there is a stretch, release, and all those cycles will crack it because you work hard in the metal. So bolts should be torqued tight enough where they never move. Now, since there's a lot of problems, if you're torquing down this cylinder bolt in your head of your car, and suppose there was a lot of rust underneath the head of the bolt, and there was an excess friction there. When you twist it down and apply a certain torque with your torque wrench, that extra friction, do you think it would actually stretch the bolt tight enough, or to be too little?
Too little.
It would actually be too little. Yeah, so friction, excessive friction under the head would give you all that, yeah, you're twisting real hard, but the bolt never stretched enough. And it didn't pull the parts together tight enough. All the friction's up at the head. Now what if you had bolt damaged threads where the threads were all rusty and you're turning it real tight, just like the axle nut there? The threads are damaged. You may put a lot of torque on it, but are you really joining those pieces together? You may not be because of excessive thread damage. Yeah. And so the friction under here and the friction on the threads is a major consideration. Now on some hardware, so what if you said, I don't care about torque wrenches, is there a better way of doing it? Now on the Piper Navajo, on the connecting rod bolts, what they have done is said, you know what, there's too many inaccuracies. You could have damage, a little minor imperfections over the head. You could also have minor imperfections of the threads. we have a better way. And what you do is they're custom ground bolts. You measure them with a micrometer, and then you turn the nut until the bolt stretches a certain amount. And no matter if the threads aren't perfect here or the threads are not perfect there, you would always come out with the right amount of pinching together force. Does that sound like a good idea? Yeah, that way, no matter what happens, each bolt is going to be doing its job. So there are many other cases where, ideas where they've eliminated the problems with under the head friction and under the, in the threaded zone. Now, when guys come along, and suppose you're tightening a crankcase stud or something like that, or someplace where torque is really, really important, we have repeated cycles where it's going to fail if you don't do it right. And what if you threw a big stack of washers? What if I put 5 washers under there?
Because the bolt's too long.
Yeah. Now, would that act like a slippery bearing? And when I tighten it down, do you think I would overstretch that bolt because of the lack of friction under here? Yeah, with a big stack of washers and you're tightening it down, it acts like a slippery bearing. And the torque reading that the book gives you for standard torque would actually be too much for all those extra washers. Yes?
Do they ever give you lubricated torque specs?
Yeah.
Yes, they do. On some airplanes, like the Continentals, many Continentals will give you, the bigger Continental engines have a lubricated thread. They say use 50% oil and 50% STP oil treatment, which is basically just an oil thickener. You mix them together, or maybe 10%, 10 to 90, I forgot what the percentage was. But you mix those two together and you use it as a thread lubricant. And so that way, they just kind of try to even things out. Some engines will say lubricated threads, others will say dry, clean, cadmium plated good threads. So on certain areas, you cannot get away with improper torque. The thing will split apart eventually and the engine will fail. But other things like car tires, car wheels, the designers put a massive safety margin in there, because they know there are going to be a lot of people in the world that don't know how to torque things down right. One guy will leave them too loose, another guy will walk in with an impact wrench and go 10 times too tight. So they build these massive safety margins in car wheel torques and stuff like that. But in airplane engine crankcases and other areas, they don't put that big safety margin. You have to be doing it right. Okay, so does it make sense how any extra lubrication here, or any lubrication on the threads, or a stack of washers may alter the amount that's twisted? Now, on many of today's cars, instead of using a torque figure, what they'll use is you snug the bolt down, and then you may go an additional 3/4 of a turn. Now, does that sound like it might be a good idea? Because it gives you the right amount of bolt stretch. You figure out how many threads you have per inch, you go 3/4 of a turn, and the bolt is going to stretch that much. So that's a good way of doing it too. That way you end up getting every bolt working the same amount. So there are many things that can affect bolt torque. Now the biggest thing, and many times in the airplane world, when you're dealing with these long through studs, that stud goes all the way through that crankcase on this engine, and all these engines here have bolts this long. And you're squeezing a soft metal. If you remember on the Rockwell hardness tester, remember how the penetrator ball goes into the metal? It goes in, and then you wait a little bit, and it keeps on sinking for a little while. It takes a time for the metal to move. And when you're dealing with torquing down soft metals, dealing with long bolts, you have to give everything lots of time to slowly move, squeeze, and stretch. And so click type torque wrenches, the kind that make a little click when you obtain the desired torque, will automatically release the tension as soon as you get up to the maximum amount. And that's not what you need when you're doing long bolts and soft metals. You need a torque wrench that will maintain that torque. So either a flexible beam where it will hold, you have to hold that torque, you can see exactly what you have. Or this is a variation, it just has it's just flexing metal inside, and it will give you, you know, a nice steady torque. It doesn't click and release the torque. So on some of your Lycoming engine manuals, they specify do not use a click type wrench or anything that releases the load when doing crankcase through studs. It will come out wrong, the engine's going to eventually fail. So some manuals even tell you. And most people don't know that. And some guys are sold on the click wrenches. They think it costs lots of money and it makes it click, so it must be better. But the accuracy on a flexible beam is actually a few percent higher than a click type wrench. And the fact that this click wrench releases its torque quickly is a bad thing in most cases. You know, if you have a real short stud, then it doesn't really, you know, it ends up not mattering a whole bunch because you don't have a long stud and a big soft piece of aluminum to squeeze. So you notice less of a difference, like a car, you know, wheel nut or something like that. Now, I've experimented on short studs. I did it with my flexible, I did it with a click. I clicked it, then it came along with a flexible beam, and it came out just the same. But when you have a long studs, you're going to notice that the bolt just keeps on turning for a long time. You get an additional portion of a turn. Now, so the torque specs are set for, on these bolts, are dry, clean, cadmium plated threads. And what you want to do is spin the, you know, tighten, you're going to be torquing the nut down instead of trying to torque the bolt down, because there's a lot of friction on the side here. As that bolt spins around through a hole, that will give you an inaccurate reading. So these bolts will go through, almost all the time they come through the brake disc coming forward, and then you put the nut on the forward side. Okay, so let me punch this thing through there. Now it's kind of dirty, ugly, rusty. All right, so I'm going to put a washer on. I'm going to put the nut on. Hey, let's do it with a click type wrench. A lot of guys that just go and say, yeah, that's good enough. If you're in the middle of nowhere and you have nothing, you're going to guess at it. Okay?
It's turning in the back.
Yeah, okay. All right, let me see here. Okay. Go slowly. Yeah, okay. Okay, now we're going to go with a click type wrench. Here, so I'll leave it there.
Gonna pop the extension
All right, yeah. Take this off.
Now with the extension, you gonna factor something with that?
No,
Sure.
because it's just straight down. It's on the pivot
But if
axis.
it's this way, then it's different.
Yeah, it's the distance out this way. But the long extension, short extension, even if you're, suppose you had a 10-foot long extension and that extension twisted. If I
So the
put,
torque's still there.
if I put, you know, 100 pounds of force into here, it has to go out there. It may have a lot of bend, but whatever I apply here has to go there. And they do make flexible, twistable impact
Yeah, I've seen them.
extensions
They
of
twist.
different colors and
Yeah.
diameters. And then that way you can use it for a, yeah, they can use it with the impact gun, and it has enough.
I throw it to their forehead
Oh, okay.
because they don't know how to use them.
Yeah, so you know, the thing will twist enough to absorb the shock of the impact gun and keep guys from over torquing them,
Supposedly.
theoretically. Yeah.
Depends on how much air pressure is applying.
Yeah, so impact drivers are bad news. They kind of hammer the hardware. And so if I use this click type wrench, let me torque this down.
And what do you set that to?
I have it set to 90 pound-inches. Okay, so I'm going to hold it here, and I go
There you
click,
go.
and guys go click, click, click. Oh,
Oh, a
okay.
couple times?
Click it a couple times. The more I click it, the better it is. And then I think, okay, I've done a great job. More clicks is better. And then you take your flexible beam. Now, hopefully I don't make a fool out of myself, because what if these threads are so rusty, I look like an idiot. But that's okay. I don't think I will. Okay, so if I hold this thing here, And then I put this on here, and I come up to 90. Look at this. Look at, I come up to 90 pounds, and look, it moved more. Let me see if I had it just right. Yeah. So it turned an additional amount. Now, the softer the metal, the longer the bolt, the more you're going to see it turn. And
Even
that
when
wasn't
you're at
much.
90? So this
Yeah.
one you were at 90 and you're still going.
I'm still going a little bit. Yeah. And on a magnesium wheel, this is an aluminum wheel, but on the magnesium wheels, you really notice the difference because that's a real soft metal. And the long skinny bolts, that metal just slowly squeezes. And you just keep on cranking. You go around the circle, you crank a little more, you keep going around. And when you've gone around enough times where nothing changes, then it is torque. This
you still keep
this
it the
harder
same
aluminum
degree
wheel.
of torque, right?
Yeah,
So let's
you
say
keep-
90, you keep
right.
going, keep going.
You keep going around the circle.
Okay.
And when that torque wrench no longer gives you any additional fraction of a turn, then it's actually torqued. So,
How do you set the torque on that one?
oh, what you have to do, you can set the pointer.
Oh, okay.
You can set the pointer, or you could just rotate it this way right to 90 and then go till it reads 0.
Oh, so the way you know it's at 90 is when it goes back to 0?
No.
I'm
Well, you
confused.
could, okay, take a look here. Take a look
I see
here.
what you're saying.
Okay, I can set it and read 90, or I can set the pointer right on 90, and then just go up till it meets the
okay.
pointer. Or what if I set it on 90 on this side, and said I'm going to use 0 as my reference point. The 0 is real easy to read,
Yeah.
you know. 0 is easy to read. So there are guys that are totally attached to their click type torque wrenches, but you can see that with the long hardware, they
You still
present
got
a
a
major
few more.
problem, and manuals prohibit the use of them. And I've told people, and at first they say, it doesn't matter, you're full of baloney. And then, guys that build engines and stuff, and then about 2 or 3 weeks later, when it's time to put their engine together, they think about it, they think, you know what, I think I'm gonna use this flexible beam wrench, because after they think about it a while, they think, oh, those bolts do slowly stretch. That metal slowly does deform. That aluminum compresses and all that stuff.
Oh.
And so, thick type torque wrenches,
What situations do you use those?
you know what,
In
I
butt
hardly ever use it.
situations.
If it's real short,
Situations where you want to sabotage.
yeah,
Work.
on situations where you have a very, very short bolt, very, very short hardware, where you may not gain any additional advantage because you have a hard metal and a short stud.
What about the opposite? Like releasing bolts? Then you'd want to use a torque wrench, no? Or you never
Normally
do?
you don't use a torque wrench on releasing.
No, if you're
So-
releasing,
You use a breaker bar.
Sabotage or breaking them? That's the only time you want to use them, right?
Yeah, so I'm not a click type wrench fan. This is the only one I own. I try to get all the flexible beam.
I know that with the aircraft ones you have to go into maintain these.
Yeah.
And so do these have a longer life in terms of
Actually, this is high quality, long life. Yeah, this is real
but
expensive.
how do
one.
you know when you have to recalibrate
Oh,
them?
actually, we have a torque wrench checker at work.
Okay.
We have one. It has a swinging weight. Swinging weights. You just stick it on the wall and read it. And if it doesn't
Gotcha.
read like it should, then we say, I think it's bad.
You also have ones with lights, so if you can't see it, and the light clicks on,
Yeah.
they
Oh, I got my fancy one. I just bought a used one. Now this one is equivalent to a flexible beam, and it vibrates. When you get up to the maximum torque,
Nice.
it